They lost everything before they understood why. Their trust collapsed there. Ports went dark, and I was already sitting in there. Boardroom when the locks changed. They called her a clerical. Beneficiary. A footnote. A name that didn't matter. They smiled while they erased her from the revenue. They quoted policy. While they stole her future, they thought silence meant weakness. They were laughing at their own. Funeral. When Aurelian adjusted the brushed platinum Nautilus compass pendant at her collarbone. She wasn't angry. She was counting. Leases. Counting dates. Counting. The moment their authority expired, they made one. Mistake. They reclassified what should never be touched. They forgot that income is loud, but infrastructure is. Permanent. In the next 60 minutes, you will watch an institution destroy itself. With its own paperwork, you will see how a woman they underestimated never raised her voice. She let the system do the screaming. Stay. This is not revenge. This is ownership. The envelope did not arrive by standard post. It sat on the mahogany console of the foyer, delivered by a courier whose shoes didn't scuff the floor. It was heavy cream-colored and bore the embossed seal of Whitcomb and Rowe Trust Services. Aurelian Knox-Delmare did not rush to open it. She let her coat slide from her shoulders, her fingers briefly grazing the brushed platinum Nautilus compass pendant resting against her collarbone. The metal was cool. It felt like a steadying hand. She took a silver letter opener and made a single surgical incision. The document inside was a masterpiece of corporate erasure. It used words like restructured and optimized to mask the scent of a funeral. On page 3, the betrayal was laid bare in a single sterile sentence. It declared her interests in her father's maritime holdings as non-dosh, controlling in the language of the elite. That word was a death sentence. It meant she was a guest in her own house. It meant Edgar Whitcomb III had decided she was a clerical error to be corrected. Aurelian read the notice once. She did not flinch. She did not reach for a phone to call a lawyer who was likely already on Whitcomb's payroll. Instead, she folded the paper perfectly, lining the corners until they were sharp enough to cut. She saw what they expected her to miss. Edgar Whitcomb was a man of prestige, but men of prestige often lack the patience for fine print. In his haste to strip her of the revenue streams, he had focused on the gold and forgotten the soil it was buried in. Her eyes locked onto a footnote on the final page. It was a standard liability waiver, referencing an asset category labeled Subsurface Navigational EASEMENTS.2A trustee. It looked like a dead-end legal formality. To Aurelian, it was a confession. That category shouldn't have existed in a standard trust restructuring. Its presence meant Whitcomb wasn't just stealing her income. He was trying to hide the fact that he had already sold something he didn't yet own. She stood by the window, watching the rain streak against the glass like tears on a face that refused to cry. She touched the Nautilus compass again. Edgar Whitcomb III believed that proximity to wealth was the same thing as ownership. He believed that because he held the keys to the vault, he owned the silver inside. He was a third-generation administrator who had mistaken his desk for a throne. Aurelian knew better. She had been raised by a man who ensured the empires other men built. She understood that a ship is only as strong as the law that allows it to dock. She walked to her study and sat behind a desk that had no computer, only a ledger and a fountain pen. She began to map out the infrastructure of Whitcomb's life. Every offshore account, every silent partner, every debt he had hidden under the veil of fiduciary duty. He had removed her name from the revenue streams. He had ignored her inquiries. He had treated her like a ghost in the machine of his ambition. What he failed to realize was that ghosts are the only ones who can walk through walls. The betrayal wasn't the theft of the money. The money was a fluctuating number on a screen. The betrayal was the assumption that she was weak enough to be managed. Aurelian Knox-Delmare did not get angry. She became a mathematician. She began to calculate the exact cost of Edgar Whitcomb's existence. By the time she was finished, he wouldn't just be poor. He would be legally invisible. The footnote was the first thread. She reached out and pulled it. Aurelian Knox-Delmare did not go to the headquarters of Whitcomb and Rowe. She did not send an email that could be flagged or a letter that could be shredded. Instead, she drove to a small windowless office in the Port District, a place where the air smelled of salt and old ink. This was the office of Maritime Registry. It was a relic of a pre-digital age, filled with paper deeds and sovereign seals. It was a place Edgar Whitcomb III would never step foot in. Because he believed power lived in skyscrapers, not basements. She placed a single document on the counter. It was an old salvage lien, signed by her father 30 years ago and never liquidated. In the eyes of a modern banker, this was junk paper. But under the 1924 Hague Rules of Carriage, it was a dormant predator. Because Whitcomb had restructured the trust, he had technically moved the assets into a new legal entity. In doing so, he had accidentally triggered a clause that made this old lien the primary debt on every vessel the trust owned. Aurelian watched the clerk stamp the filing. It made a dull, heavy thud. That sound was the first stone in the avalanche that would bury Edgar Whitcomb's career. She returned to her car and checked her watch. It was 4 o'clock. In 15 minutes, Whitcomb would be finishing his third scotch at the Union Club, feeling invincible. He would be laughing about the Matriarch, who had finally been put in her place. He didn't know that his signature on the restructuring notice was actually a confession of insolvency. Aurelian leaned back in the leather seat, her fingers tracing the sharp edges of the Nautilus pendant. She wasn't just taking her money back. She was dismantling the logic of his world. Whitcomb believed in policy. Aurelian believed in precedent. By tomorrow morning, the automated clearing systems for the global maritime banks would receive a flag. Not a red flag, those were too obvious. It would be a gray flag, a request for clarification on sovereign deeds. It would stop the flow of capital, too. Whitcomb's firm for exactly 72 hours in the world of high finance. 72 hours of silence is the same as a heart attack. Aurelian closed her eyes and visualized the panic that would soon grip the mahogany halls of Whitcomb and Rowe. They would look for a thief. They would look for a hacker. They would look for a competitor. They would never look for a daughter who knew how to read a footnote. She started the engine. The engine purred with the same quiet, expensive precision as her plan. She had lived her life in the shadows of her father's empire. Learning the secret language of ownership, now she was finally speaking. And the first thing she was saying was, goodbye, 72 hours, to the rest of the world. 3 days is a weekend or a brief vacation. To Edgar Whitcomb III, it was the duration of a slow-motion execution. Aurelian sat in a dim cafe across from the glass tower of Whitcomb and Rowe. She didn't need to be inside to see the rot spreading. The gray flag she had planted in the Maritime Registry had done its work. Across the globe, the automated systems of the Big Four banks had paused. Wire transfers intended for the Whitcomb Trust were diverted into escrow pending verification. It was a polite, digital way of saying the money no longer recognized its master. Aurelian watched a fleet of black sedans pull up to the tower. These weren't clients. These were the auditors. She touched the Nautilus compass pendant. The brushed platinum felt warm now, heated by her skin. She remembered her father's voice, a man who built his life on the invisible lines of the sea. Ownership is a story, he had told her. If you control the grammar, you control the gold. Edgar had tried to rewrite her story. He had called her non-controlling. She opened a leather-bound folder on the table. Inside was the expansion of that mysterious footnote, the subsurface navigational EASEMENTS. In the late 19th century, a series of sovereign deeds granted her family's ancestors the rights to the littoral sea floor beneath 3 major international shipping lanes. Not the water, not the fish. The ground. When Whitcomb restructured the trust, he had moved the ships and the revenue into his new entity. But he had left the easements in Aurelian's name because he thought they were worthless environmental liabilities. He was wrong. A massive, Telecommunications conglomerate was currently laying a transatlantic fiber optic cable. To complete the circuit, they had to lay that cable across the very ground Aurelian owned by removing her from the trust. Edgar had severed the trust's connection to those easements. He had essentially built a multi-million-dollar house on land he no longer had the right to stand on. Aurelian took a sip of her black coffee. It was bitter and precise. She had already sent the cease and desist order to the telecom giant. She didn't ask for money. She asked for an injunction. The injunction stopped the cable project. The project delay triggered a force majeure clause in the telecom's contract with Whitcomb's bank. The bank, fearing a massive lawsuit, had frozen Whitcomb's personal credit lines as collateral. In one morning, Aurelian had turned Edgar Whitcomb III from a titan of industry into a man whose credit card would be declined at a dry cleaner. She saw him then. He emerged from the tower, his face the color of wet ash. He was shouting into a phone that was no longer receiving. Service, he looked small. The skyscraper behind him, once his fortress, now looked like a tombstone. He looked across the street. For a split second, his eyes met hers through the cafe window. Aurelian didn't smile. She didn't wave. She picked up her fountain pen and marked a single line through his name in her ledger. The betrayal was complete, but the reclamation had just begun. He had thought he was stealing her past. He didn't realize she was already holding his future hostage. Edgar Whitcomb III did not use the crosswalk. He lunged across the street, dodging a yellow taxi, his polished Oxfords skidding on the damp asphalt. He burst into the cafe like a man escaping a fire. He didn't look like a managing partner anymore. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost in his reflection and realized the ghost was him. He slammed his hands onto Aurelian's table. The porcelain cup rattled, but the coffee inside didn't spill. Aurelian didn't move. She didn't blink. She simply looked at his hands that were used to signing away other people's lives. Now trembling under the weight of a 72-hour silence, he spoke, his voice a jagged whisper. He asked her what she had done. He talked about administrative errors and temporary liquidity freezes. He tried to use the same language he had used in the letter words designed to minimize her existence. Aurelian waited. She let the silence stretch until it became a physical weight in the room. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, melodic, and carried the absolute finality of a gavel. She told him that he was looking in the wrong direction. He was worried about the banks in New York and the auditors in his lobby. He was worried about his credit cards and his reputation at the Union Club. She informed him that while he was crossing the street, a process server in Zurich had just entered the headquarters of the Bank for International Settlements. The color drained from Edgar's face. Proximity to wealth had taught him one thing. Zurich was where the world's real owners kept their secrets. Aurelian explained the protocol of 1988. Because the maritime trusts were originally structured under a sovereign charter. Any restructuring that resulted in a loss of controlling interest for the bloodline. Heirs had to be ratified by a Swiss tribunal. Edgar had bypassed the tribunal. He had thought it was a dusty, forgotten formality. But by bypassing it, he hadn't just committed a clerical error. He had committed fiduciary treason. Under the global banking protocols she had triggered, his firm was no longer being audited for a mistake. They were being liquidated for fraud. Every asset he had restructured was now legally frozen by a court that didn't care about his pedigree or his family name. Edgar reached for his pendant, a habit of the wealthy, but he found only his silk tie. Aurelian, however, let her fingers graze the brushed platinum Nautilus compass. She told him the truth he was too arrogant to see. He had spent his life thinking the money was the power. He didn't realize that the power was the structure that allowed the money to exist. He had tried to erase her name from a ledger. In response, she was erasing his firm from the map of the financial world. She stood up. She didn't wait for him to respond. There was nothing left for him to say that could change the math. As she walked toward the door, she paused. She told him that the subsurface easements he had discarded were no longer for sale. She had leased them to a sovereign wealth fund for 99 years. Edgar Whitcomb III was left sitting in a cheap cafe, surrounded by the smell of burnt beans and the sound of a world that no longer belonged to him. Aurelian stepped out into the rain. She didn't open an umbrella. She didn't need one. The storm was exactly where she wanted it to be. She had been a beneficiary for 30 years. Now she was the architect. The collapse was not loud. It did not make the evening news. Truly elite failures happen in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. In the deletion of data packets and the shredding of ivory stock paper, 6 months after the letter arrived, the name Whitcomb and Rowe ceased to exist. It wasn't just bankrupt. It was liquidated, its assets absorbed by a holding company whose board of directors consisted of a single, unnamed entity registered in the Cayman Islands. Aurelian Knox-Delmare stood on the deck of a refurbished maritime salvage vessel, Aurelian. The ship was a ghost of her father's era, now fitted with the most advanced deep-sea surveying technology in the world. In her hand, she held the original sterile notice Edgar had sent her. The paper was yellowing, the ink of the word non-controlling, looking faint and pathetic in the bright glare of the mid-Atlantic sun. She didn't burn it, she didn't tear it, she simply let go. The wind caught the paper, carrying it over the railing. It fluttered like a broken wing before touching the surface of the water. For a moment, it floated. Then the weight of the salt took it and it vanished into the depths, into the very easements she now controlled. She adjusted the brushed platinum Nautilus compass pendant. It was no longer just a signature item. It was the key to a legacy that had been successfully defended. Below deck, the servers hummed. They were processing the data from the fiber optic lines crossing her seafloor territory. Every byte of data, every high-frequency trade, and every diplomatic cable passing through those wires paid a micro-toll to her estate. She had moved beyond inheritance. She had become the infrastructure Edgar Whitcomb III was reportedly living, in a rented cottage in a town that didn't appear on most maps. He was no longer a trustee, was a man who spent his days checking a mailbox that remained empty, waiting for a policy that no longer applied to him. He had learned too late that silence isn't an absence of power. Silence is the sound of power when it is working perfectly. Aurelian looked out at the horizon where the sky met the sea in a line so sharp it looked like a blade. She had been dismissed as a clerical error. She had been treated as a passenger in her own life. But the matriarch's will was never about the money. It was about the direction. She turned away from the railing and walked toward the bridge. The crew didn't speak as she entered. They simply stepped aside. They didn't need orders. They knew the destination. The betrayal was a memory. The revenge was a foundation. Aurelian Knox-Delmare took her seat at the head of the table. She opened a new ledger, the first page pristine and white. She picked up her fountain pen and began to write. She wasn't writing a letter. She was writing the new law of the sea. The air in the boardroom of Whitcomb and Rowe was filtered to a surgical degree. It tasted of nothing. It was the scent of expensive neutrality. Aurelian Knox-Delmare sat at the far end of the table. She was a silhouette of mahogany and charcoal, wool against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the Manhattan skyline. Her hair was pulled back into a precise chignon. Not a single coil was out of place. She did not touch the water glass placed in front of her. She did not look at the agenda. She simply existed in the space, her eyes fixed on the door with a look of permanent, quiet appraisal. At her throat, the brushed platinum Nautilus compass pendant caught the sterile overhead light. It was a cold, steady spark. The door opened. Edgar Whitcomb III entered first. He was followed by 5 men in tailored blue suits, the board of trustees. They moved with the unearned confidence of men who believe that ownership is a birthright rather than a responsibility. Edgar did not look at Aurelian as he took his seat at the head of the table, spent 30 seconds adjusting his cufflinks and shuffling papers that had already been organized. It was a performance of importance. 'Twas an attempt to fill the silence before it consumed him. Finally, he looked toward the end of the table. He gestured toward Aurelian with a casual, dismissive wave of his hand. He told the board she was a distant relation of the late Knox-Delmare. He used the word beneficiary as if it were a synonym for charity case. He told them she was here as a courtesy to the legacy, a formality to be observed before the final restructuring vote. No one corrected him. The men in the blue suits nodded. They looked at Aurelian for a split second, then looked away. To them, she was a ghost in a high-backed chair. She was a line item on a spreadsheet that had already been deleted. Aurelian said nothing. The silence began to stretch. It moved past the point of politeness. It entered the realm of the uncomfortable. Edgar cleared his throat. He began to speak about the merger. He spoke about liquidity ratios and the acquisition of the North Atlantic dredging rights. He used the language of a conqueror, describing how the Knox-Delmare assets would be integrated into the Whitcomb Global portfolio. Aurelian watched him. She did not blink. She was not listening to his words. She was watching the way his pulse jumped in the hollow of his neck. She was listening to the slight tremor in his voice when he mentioned the dredging rights. He was lying. Natari was lying to the men in the blue suits. The silence she maintained was not passive. It was a vacuum. It forced Edgar to keep talking, forced him to fill the void with more details, more promises, and eventually more errors. The more he spoke, the more the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Aurelian shifted her gaze to the executive sitting to Edgar's right. His name was Marcus Thorne. He was the head of risk management. Achaia was the only one in the room who understood that silence is the most dangerous weapon in a negotiation. He looked at Aurelian. He looked at the Nautilus compass at her collarbone. He recognized the symbol. He knew it didn't belong to a distant relation. It belonged to the title holder of the sovereign deeds. Aurelian saw the moment the realization hit him. It was a flicker in his pupils. It was the sudden, sharp intake of breath. Marcus Thorne reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His fingers moved with a sudden, frantic energy. He wasn't checking the time. He was checking the registry of Maritime liens. Edgar was still talking. He was describing the projected revenue for the next fiscal quarter. He was painting a picture of an empire that was already hollow. Marcus Thorne's face went pale. The glow of the phone screen reflected in his eyes like a warning light. He looked from the screen to Aurelian and then back to the screen. The silence of the room was now being punctured by the sound of Marcus's rapid typing. Aurelian leaned forward. Just a fraction of an inch. The movement was so slight it was almost invisible, but to Marcus, it looked like a predator tensing for a strike. She still had not spoken a single word. Edgar stopped mid-sentence. He noticed the shift in the room. He looked at Marcus. He asked if there was a problem with the connection. Marcus did not answer immediately. He looked at the other board members. He looked at Edgar. Finally, his gaze landed on Aurelian. His hand was shaking as he placed the phone face down on the mahogany table. The board members began to murmur. The atmosphere of corporate certainty had evaporated. In its place was a thick, heavy layer of dread. Aurelian Knox-Delmare reached up and touched the Nautilus compass. The metal was no longer cold. It had absorbed her heat. She looked at Edgar Whitcomb III for the first time since the meeting began. She allowed a small, sharp light to enter her eyes. She knew what Marcus had found on his phone. He had found that the dredging rights Edgar was trying to sell didn't belong to the trust. They were tied to the subsurface easements she had reclaimed 48 hours ago. Edgar was trying to sell property that was currently under a sovereign freeze. In the eyes of the law, this wasn't a merger. It was a multi-billion-dollar fraud. Aurelian finally opened her mouth to speak. The room went so quiet that the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to dot. She told the board that the distant relation was leaving. She told them that the next time they saw her name, it wouldn't be on an agenda. It would be on an asset seizure warrant. She stood up. Every movement was deliberate. Every movement cost Edgar something he could never buy back as she walked toward the door. She heard the sound of Marcus Thorne's chair screeching against the floor. He was standing. He was trying to find the words. To stop the inevitable, Aurelian did not look back. She knew that by the time she reached the lobby, the banks would be receiving the first of the automated liquidation notices. The boardroom, that had forgot her name, was about to become the room where they learned it for the last time. Aurelian Knox-Delmare did not wait for the elevator. She walked toward the emergency stairwell, her heels clicking against the marble with the rhythm of a ticking bomb. Back in the boardroom, silence had turned into a riot of whispers. Marcus Thorne was no longer sitting. He was pacing the length of the window, his foam pressed so hard against his ear that his knuckles were white. Edgar Whitcomb III was still frozen at the head of the table. He looked at the empty chair where Aurelian had sat. He looked at the water glass she hadn't touched. He tried to reclaim the room. He raised his voice, calling for order, claiming that Aurelian was merely grandstanding. He spoke of litigation defense funds and preemptive countersuits. But the men in the blue suits weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at their own devices. The gray flag Aurelian had planted was no longer a quiet warning. It had evolved, because Edgar had attempted to pledge the dredging rights as collateral for the merger. He had triggered an automated event of default across 4 separate international jurisdictions. Aurelian reached the lobby and stepped out into the crisp, biting air of the city. She pulled a small, encrypted tablet from her bag. She did not call a lawyer. She opened a terminal connected to the Swiss Maritime Tribunal with 3 keystrokes. She executed the Sovereign Ghost Protocol. This was the institutional revenge she had spent years perfecting. It was not a simple lawsuit. It was a misclassification foreclosure by proving that the infrastructure of the trusts, the literal seafloor, and the navigational easements belonged to her as a sovereign deed holder. She effectively turned every contract Edgar had signed into a legal ghost. If the land beneath the ships is not owned by the trust, the ships cannot legally dock. If the ships cannot dock, the revenue streams cease to exist. Aurelian watched the digital map on her screen. She saw the red markers begin to appear over the Atlantic shipping lanes, one by one. The vessels belonging to Whitcomb and Rowe were being issued notice of trespass by maritime authorities in the boardroom. The lights flickered. It was a momentary power surge, but to the men inside, it felt like the building itself was rejecting them. Marcus Thorne stopped pacing. He looked at Edgar with a cold, terrifying clarity. He told Edgar that the banks hadn't just frozen the accounts. They had revoked the firm's fiduciary license in the eyes of the global banking system. Whitcomb and Rowe Trust Services no longer had the authority to manage a single cent. Edgar's mouth opened. No sound came out. The policy he had hidden behind for 3 generations had just been rewritten by a woman he had called a distant relation. Aurelian reached her car. She didn't look back at the tower. She knew exactly what was happening inside. The auditors would arrive in 11 minutes. The federal marshals would arrive in 20. She touched the brushed platinum Nautilus compass pendant. It felt heavy now, a solid weight of victory against her skin. She had been raised to know that ownership never announces itself. It simply waits for the pretenders to exhaust themselves. Edgar Whitcomb III had spent his life thinking he was the master of the house because he held the keys. He never realized that Aurelian owned the ground the house was built on as her car pulled away from the curb. Aurelian saw Edgar emerge from the revolving doors. He wasn't running anymore. He was stumbling. He looked at the street, at the cars, at the people passing by. For the first time in his life, he was seeing a world where his name meant nothing. The boardroom had forgotten her name. Now the world would forget his. Aurelian Knox-Delmare leaned back into the shadows of the car. She closed her eyes and let the silence wash over her. It was the silence of a completed ledger. It was the silence of a matriarch. The fall of Edgar Whitcomb III did not stop at the glass doors of his office. It followed him home. Aurelian Knox-Delmare sat in the back of her car, watching the digital feed of the foreclosure proceedings. She did not feel joy. She felt the cold satisfaction of a mathematician who had finally balanced a long-corrupted equation. The strategy was a surgical application of the cross-collateralization clause. When Edgar had restructured the Knox-Delmare trusts, He had tied his own personal real estate holdings to the firm's performance to secure a lower interest rate on a private loan. He believed the firm was bulletproof. He believed his proximity to her father's wealth acted as a shield. He was wrong by triggering the fiduciary license revocation. Aurelian had effectively turned Edgar's personal assets into a pool of unsecured liability. Aurelian watched on her screen as the first of the seizure notices was posted. To the gates of the Whitcomb estate in Greenwich. The house was a monument to unearned status. It was a sprawling colonial mansion filled with art that had been bought with commissions stolen from her family's legacy. Now, under the Sovereign Deed Recovery Act, that property was being reclassified as restitution for systemic fraud. Aurelian reached up and touched the Nautilus compass pendant. The brushed platinum was a silent witness to the reclamation. She thought about the way Edgar had looked in the boardroom, the way he had dismissed her as a distant relation. He had looked at her mahogany skin and her quiet demeanor and assumed she lacked the stomach for the kill. He had mistaken her deliberation for weakness. He had mistaken her silence for absence now. He was learning that silence is the sound of a trap closing. As the car glided through the rain-slicked streets, Aurelian received a final notification. The Swiss tribunal had reached its verdict because of the third port protocols. The court had ruled that the Knox-Delmare assets were never legally part of the Whitcomb and Rowe portfolio. This meant that every dollar Edgar had spent in the last 6 months was technically a theft from a sovereign estate. The debt he owed her was now greater than the value of everything he owned. Aurelian pulled the car over near a small, quiet park. She stepped out, her charcoal wool coat shielding her from the mist. She looked at the city, the towers of steel and glass that men like Edgar used to hide their crimes. She knew that by tomorrow morning, Edgar would be standing on a sidewalk with nothing but the suit on his back. His accounts would be zeroed. His name would be a black mark in every banking database from New York to Singapore. The betrayal had been an attempt to erase her. The revenge had been the total erasure of him. She took a slow, deep breath. The air smelled of wet earth and salt, the smell of a world that was finally clean. She turned her gaze back to her tablet. There was one final task. She opened the file for the boardroom that forgot her name. She moved the file into an archive labeled settled. But as she scrolled down, a new notification appeared. It was an encrypted message from an unknown source in the Gulf Coast. The message contained a single image, a weathered shipping manifest from 1954. It bore her father's signature and a coordinate that didn't correspond to any known port. Aurelian's almond-set eyes narrowed. The appraisal began again. Edgar Whitcomb III was a footnote. He was a distraction. The real architecture of her father's empire was much deeper than a Manhattan boardroom. She touched the Nautilus compass. The needle didn't move, but she felt the direction change. The Matriarch's will was not a document of the past. It was a map of a future that the world was not yet prepared to see. She stepped back into the car. "To the harbor," she said. Her voice was a low, steady current. The boardroom was gone. The sea was waiting. The car came to a halt at the edge of the industrial pier. Here, the skyscrapers were replaced by rusted cranes that looked like skeletal giants bowed in prayer. The air was thick with the scent of diesel and ancient silt. Aurelian Knox-Delmare stepped out of the vehicle. The wind off the water was sharp, pulling at the stray edges of her charcoal coat, but her chignon remained unmoved. She looked down at the tablet in her hand, the 1954 manifest glowing against the darkness of the pier. The coordinates led to a stretch of the Gulf Coast that the official maps labeled as unnavigable shoals. To the public, it was a graveyard for shallow draft vessels. To her father, it had been a sanctuary. As she walked toward the edge of the dock, her fingers went to the Nautilus compass pendant. She realized now that the pendant wasn't just a symbol of maritime law. It was a key to a geography that Edgar Whitcomb III could never have understood. Edgar had chased the money. Aurelian was chasing the source. In the distance, a single signal light blinked from the fog. It wasn't the rhythmic pulse of a lighthouse. It was a coded sequence her father had taught her to read. Before she could read a ledger, the sequence translated to a single word: acknowledge. Aurelian stood at the very edge of the concrete, her deep mahogany skin catching the silver reflection of the moon on the water. She did not feel fear. She felt the weight of a multi-generational secret finally shifting onto her shoulders. The manifest from 1954 indicated that her father hadn't just insured shipping empires. He had created a third port, a sovereign, offshore data and bullion vault that operated outside the jurisdiction of any terrestrial government. This was why Whitcomb's restructuring had been so dangerous. He hadn't just been stealing her income, he had been unknowingly poking a hole in a global silence that kept the world's true economy afloat. If the boardroom had forgotten her name, it was because her father had scrubbed it from the records to protect her. She took a small laser pointer from her bag and aimed it at the fog. She clicked it 3 times, echoing the rhythm of the signal light. Acknowledge. From the mist, the hull of a black, sleek vessel began to emerge. It had no name on its bow. It had no flag on its mast. It moved with a silence that defied physics. Cutting through the water without a wake, Aurelian knew that once she stepped onto that deck, there was no returning to the world of corporate litigation and boardroom maneuvers. She would no longer be fighting a trustee. She would be defending a sovereign legacy against those who truly ran the world. She looked back at the city one last time. The lights of the skyscrapers looked like dim embers compared to the cold blue light emanating from the vessel in the fog. Edgar Whitcomb III was currently sitting in a cold room, wondering how a distant relation had destroyed him. Aurelian turned her back on the city. She stepped onto the gangway of the nameless ship. As her foot touched the steel, the Nautilus, compass at her throat, hummed a low-frequency vibration that resonated in her very bones. The Matriarch's will was finally open. The first chapter was written in the salt of the deep. The room smelled of old paper and the sharp smote, metallic Thames of an ozone-heavy air purifier. It was a basement office within the Maritime Authority, a place where history went to be buried under layers of bureaucratic dust. Aurelian Knox-Delmare sat across from a desk piled high with digital tablets and physical ledgers. She looked like a sculpture carved from mahogany. Her dark eyes were fixed on the clerk, a man whose shirt collar was as frayed as his patience. She had made a simple request. She wanted the historical port maintenance records for the Southern Gulf sector. Spanning the years 1940 to 1960, the clerk didn't look up from his screen. He told her those records were classified under a dormant security statute. He said they were unavailable for public or private review. He spoke with the flat, dead tone of a man who believed his no was the final word in the room. Aurelian did not sigh. She did not reach for her purse to offer a bribe. She simply adjusted the brushed platinum Nautilus compass pendant at her collarbone. The metal felt like an anchor, grounding her in the weight of the law. She spoke again. Her voice was a low, steady vibration that seemed to calm the erratic ticking of the wall clock. She told the clerk she wasn't asking as a member of the public. She was citing the Maritime Continuity Clauses of 1926. The clerk paused. His fingers stopped hovering over the keyboard. For the first time, he looked at her. He saw the high-sculpted cheekbones and the almond-set eyes that looked through him rather than at him. He told her he had never heard of those clauses. He said he would need to consult with legal counsel. Aurelian waited. She sat in the silence for 10 minutes, her hands resting perfectly still in her lap. She was calculating the exact moment the trap of the 1926 statute would snap shut. The 1926 clauses were not just old laws. They were the skeletal structure of international shipping. They dictated that any entity holding a sovereign deed to the seafloor had the right to audit the maintenance of the infrastructure above it. By denying her the records, the Maritime Authority was technically committing an act of sovereign default. The door to the inner office opened. A man in a sharp charcoal suit walked out. He was the lead counsel for the Port Authority. He looked like a man who spent his life winning arguments by exhausting his opponents. He held a copy of Aurelian's request. He looked at her name. He looked at her pendant. Dud. He asked her a single question. He asked how a clerical beneficiary like her even knew that a 1926 statute existed. He said that law hadn't been cited in a court of law in over 70 years. Aurelian leaned forward. The movement was slow and carried the gravity of a shifting tide. She told him that some people learn history to pass a test. Others learn it because they own the ground the history was written on. She informed him that if the records were not produced within the next 60 minutes, she would initiate a forensic maritime lien. The lead counsel's pulse jumped at the base of his throat. He knew what that meant. Forensic lien would freeze the operations of the entire port. It would stop every ship, every crane, and every dollar of revenue until the audit was complete. He looked at the clerk. He looked back at Aurelian. The room grew colder. The internal monologue of the lead counsel was visible in the way his eyes darted toward the phone on the desk. He was realizing that Edgar Whitcomb III was not the only one who had underestimated her. Aurelian watched the realization settle. She knew that the restructuring Edgar had performed was a house of cards. But these records, these dusty, hidden ledgers, were the wind that would blow it down. She was not just looking for maintenance logs. She was looking for the evidence of the third port. She was looking for the secret her father had died to protect. The lead counsel asked for a moment, stepped back into his office, and closed the door. Aurelian remained in her chair. She was a silhouette of absolute certainty. She touched the Nautilus compass. She felt the direction of the power in the building shift. It was no longer moving toward the legal counsel. It was moving toward her. The ledger refused to balance because it was missing the most important variable. It was missing the matriarch. The door to the inner office stayed closed for exactly 42 minutes. Inside, the muffled sound of frantic phone calls echoed, calls to Zurich, calls to the Department of State, and calls to the archives in the Gulf. When the lead counsel finally emerged, his composure was gone. His charcoal suit seemed to hang heavy on his shoulders. He carried a single thick binder bound in crumbling leather. It was the physical manifest of the 1954 port maintenance records. He placed it on the desk with a heavy thud. The dust that billowed from the cover danced in the sterile light of the basement office. The counsel did not sit down. He stood, his hands gripping the back of the clerk's chair. He told Aurelian that these records were never meant to be digitized. They were meant to be forgotten. He warned her that opening this book would trigger a legal chain reaction that neither of them could control. Aurelian did not hesitate. She opened the binder. Her fingers, steady and precise, turned the yellowed pages. She was not looking for maintenance costs or labor hours. She was looking for a specific ledger entry code, code 77-alpha, at approximately 50% through the volume. She found it. The entry was dated November 12, 1954. It wasn't signed by a Port Authority official. It was signed by Edgar Whitcomb Sr., the grandfather of the man currently trying to erase her. The entry described a structural adjustment to the southern pier, but the math didn't add up. The materials requested were enough to build a small island, yet the pier remained unchanged. Aurelian's eyes narrowed as she read the internal notes. The adjustment wasn't for the pier. It was for the diversion of a deep-water channel. She realized the revelation in an instant. The Whitcomb family hadn't built their wealth through service. They had built it by stealing the sea. They had used her father's maritime insurance assets to fund the construction of a private, off-the-books docking facility, the third port, and then buried the debt within the public ports. Maintenance records. This was the original sign of the Whitcomb dynasty. Edgar Whitcomb III thought he was restructuring a trust. In reality, he was trying to hide a 70-year-old crime of maritime embezzlement that was now coming due. The lead counsel watched her face. He saw the exact moment she found the discrepancy. He asked her if she understood the implications. He said that if this became public, it wouldn't just be Whitcomb and Rowe that collapsed. It would bankrupt the entire Port Authority. Aurelian looked up from the ledger. She touched the brushed platinum Nautilus compass pendant. It felt cold, stark contrast to the heat rising in the council's face. She told him that the truth doesn't care about the economy. It only cares about the balance. She informed him that under the 1926 statute, she was now the receiver, in fact, for every asset touched by this fraud. This was the turning point. Edgar didn't just owe her money. He was living in a house built on her father's stolen seafloor, funded by a crime his grandfather had documented in a book he thought was lost. The lead counsel asked her how she knew the statute. He asked why her father had never come for this. Aurelian stood up, closing the binder with a final decisive snap. She told him that her father wasn't waiting for the right law. He was waiting for the right daughter. She walked toward the exit, the binder tucked under her arm. The clerk and the counsel stood in the silence of the basement, watching the shadow of the matriarch disappear into the stairwell. The ledger that refused to balance was finally in her hands, and she was ready to collect the interest. The confrontation did not happen in a courtroom. It happened in the penthouse of the Whitcomb Tower. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Edgar Whitcomb III was sitting in the dark, the city lights below him looking like distant, unreachable jewels. The air in the room was stale, heavy with the scent of expensive scotch and the copper temps of desperation. He heard the door chime a soft, melodic sound that felt like a death knell. Aurelian Knox-Delmare entered. She did not turn on the lights. She carried the leather binder like a shield. She placed the manifest on the mahogany desk between them. The sound of the heavy book hitting the wood echoed through the empty suite. Edgar did not look up. He asked her if she had come to watch the end. He spoke of bad timing and unforeseeable market shifts. Aurelian did not answer his excuses. She opened the binder to the page, signed by his grandfather in 1954. She told him that timing had nothing to do with his failure. She told him that his family had been bankrupt for 70 years. They just hadn't realized it yet. She pointed to the Code 77 Alpha entry. She explained the doctrine of constructive trust, because the third port had been built using diverted funds from her father's insurance holdings. The law viewed the entire Whitcomb empire as a fruit of a poisoned tree. Every building they owned, every trust they managed, and every cent of interest they had collected since 1954 belonged to the Knox-Delmare estate. Aurelian leaned over the desk, her almond-set eyes reflecting the cold blue light of the digital clock on the wall. She touched the Nautilus compass pendant. She told him she wasn't there to sue him. She was there to inform him that the foreclosure had already been processed through the Swiss tribunal. She had not just taken the money. She had liquidated the family name. By tomorrow morning, the Whitcomb name would be removed from the building. The charitable foundations would be seized. The art on the walls would be tagged for auction. Edgar finally looked up. His face was a mask of gray ash. He asked where he was supposed to go. Aurelian did not offer pity. Pity was for the weak. And she was the matriarch. She told him that he was now what he had always accused her of being, a distant relation to a legacy that no longer existed. She turned to leave. At the door, she paused. She did not look back. She told him that the third port was finally under her control. The secret his grandfather had tried to hide was now her foundation as she stepped into the hallway. She heard the sound of glass breaking behind her. It was the sound of a man realizing that his entire history was a clerical error. Aurelian Knox-Delmare walked toward the elevator. The ledger was finally balanced. The interest had been paid in full. She stepped out into the night. The rain had stopped. The city was silent. The matriarch's will was no longer a promise of revenge. It was a statement of fact. The luxury car glided toward the edge of the southern Gulf Coast, where the paved roads dissolved into gravel and the gravel dissolved into the salt-cracked earth of the old world. This was the territory of the unnavigable shoals, a place where the GPS signal died and the law of the land was replaced by the law of the deep. Aurelian Knox-Delmare stepped out of the vehicle. The air here was heavy, saturated with the scent of decaying cypress and the sharp metallic temps of the open ocean. She did not look like a woman who had just dismantled a Manhattan dynasty. She looked like a queen returning to a kingdom she had never seen but had always known. At her throat, the brushed platinum Nautilus compass pendant caught the dying light of the sunset. It glowed with a faint inner warmth, reacting to the magnetic shift of the coastline. She opened the leather binder one last time. She wasn't looking at the 1954 manifest now. She was looking at a set of coordinates. Her father had hand-etched into the inside of the back cover. Coordinates that only became visible when exposed to the salt air of the transients. If you're using like a scanner app and it's like, you're gonna die. With my light, look at this and like it is a light assist. Look at this. And we all know I've been exploring that. Gulf, the third port, was not a building. It was a node. In the distance, past the line where the water met the sky, a structure began to emerge from the evening fog. It was a massive, dark silhouette, decommissioned oil platform that had been stripped of its machinery and repurposed into a high-security sovereign data vault. This was the hidden infrastructure that Edgar's grandfather had helped build and then tried to steal. It was the nerve center of the world's shadow maritime economy. Aurelian stood at the edge of the pier, her almond-set eyes fixed on the horizon. She knew that by reclaiming this asset, she was no longer just fighting a family feud. She was stepping into the sights of the global power players, the court of the seven seas who relied on the third port to move their wealth without oversight. A small, high-speed skiff approached the pier. It moved with a silent electric precision. The two men on board wore black tactical gear, but their posture was that of servants, not soldiers. They did not ask for her name. They did not ask for her papers. They looked at the Nautilus compass pendant and bowed their heads. Aurelian stepped onto the skiff. Every movement was a calculation. Every breath was a commitment to the legacy she now commanded. As the skiff sped toward the platform, she watched the mainland recede into a dim line of flickering lights. The world of Manhattan boardrooms and sterile offices was gone. She was entering the world of the unaccounted. The platform, known in the manifests as Station 77, loomed over her. It was a fortress of steel and silence. As she stepped onto the landing bay, a heavy, armored door slid open. Standing in the doorway was a woman with silver hair and eyes as cold as the North Atlantic. She held a digital ledger that looked older than the platform itself. The woman looked at Aurelian. She did not smile. She told Aurelian that they had been waiting 20 years for a Knox-Delmare to return. She asked if Aurelian was there to collect the back interest or to assume the command. Aurelian Knox-Delmare walked past her into the heart of the vault. The walls were lined with servers that hummed with the weight of 1 trillion. Encrypted secrets. She told the woman that she wasn't there to collect. She was there to recalibrate. The third port was no longer a secret to be kept. It was a weapon to be used. Aurelian sat at the central console. She placed her hands on the biometric sensors. The system recognized her mahogany skin and her bloodline pulse instantly. The screens flickered to life, showing the global shipping lanes, the offshore accounts, and the names of every man who thought they were the masters of the world, the matriarchs. Will was finally fully operational, and the first thing she did was send a single, encrypted message to the board of the seven seas. The message contained no words. It was only an image of the Nautilus compass. The silence was over. The temperature in the private terminal was exactly 68 degrees. It was the temperature of preserved history and high-stakes negotiation. Aurelian Knox-Delmare sat in a velvet-lined chair, her silhouette sharp against the frosted glass of the VIP lounge. She did not touch the crystal glass of mineral water on the table. She did not scroll through a phone. She simply sat. Her deep mahogany skin looked luminous under the soft, recessed lighting. Her hair was pulled back into that precise, low chignon. It was a hairstyle that signaled a woman who had no time for vanity because she was too busy with reality. At her throat, The brushed platinum Nautilus compass pendant caught a stray beam of light. It looked less like jewelry and more like a tactical instrument. Edgar Wickham III was pacing the length of the room. He was speaking about the global restructuring initiative. He was using words like synergy and streamlined assets. He believed he was the architect of a new era. He believed that by stripping Aurelian of her liquid inheritance, he had neutralized her. He looked at her and saw a woman with a famous name and an empty bank account. He was so blinded by the sparkle of the gold that he had forgotten to look at the mine. Aurelian let him speak. She let him exhaust his vocabulary of corporate greed. She watched the sweat begin to bead on his forehead. The silence she maintained was heavy. It was a physical force that pressed against the walls. Finally, Edgar stopped. He asked her why she wasn't arguing. He asked why she wasn't fighting for her seat at the table. Aurelian leaned forward. Her almond-set eyes locked onto his dot. She told him that the table he was sitting at didn't belong to him. She told him that the chair he was occupying was currently being leased. Edgar laughed. It was a short, nervous sound. He told her the trusts were finalized. He said the restructuring was irreversible. Aurelian reached into her leather portfolio. She did not pull out a lawsuit. She pulled out a stack of faded blue-inked Maritime surveys. She began to speak. Her voice was a low, melodic current that carried the weight of absolute authority. She told him about the dry docks in Rotterdam. She told him about the mooring rights in Singapore. She spoke of the subsurface easements beneath the 3 largest Atlantic ports. Edgar's smile faltered. He told her those were administrative details. He said they were handled by Shell Holdings and subsidiary management. Aurelian shook her head. She informed him that for 40 years, no one had audited the ultimate beneficial ownership of those Shell Holdings. Not even his father. She explained that while the Whitcomb Trust owned the ships required a place to rest. They required a place to be repaired. They required the legal right to cross the invisible lines of the seafloor. She revealed the systemic dispade strategy she had discovered. The ships generate the income. That is what Edgar had seized. But the infrastructure that the ships depend on is a separate legal entity. She touched the Nautilus compass. She felt the pulse of the machinery beneath the world's economy. She told him that every dry dock his vessels used was owned by a dormant entity known as the Blue Nautilus Registry. She watched as the blood drained from Edgar's face. He was a man of policy, and he knew that policy was nothing without a place to execute it. He asked who controlled the registry. Aurelian did not answer immediately. She let the question hang in the air like a heavy mist. She told him that the registry was not part of the trust. It was a sovereign deed. It was a gift from her father to the daughter he never acknowledged on paper. Every lease for every major port facility his firm managed was now under review. The betrayal he had committed was a misclassification of power. He thought the money was the source. He didn't realize the money was merely the shadow cast by the infrastructure. Edgar reached for his phone. His hands were shaking. He called his head of legal counsel. The room went silent as he waited for the call to connect. Aurelian watched him. She saw the exact moment the trap closed. The legal counsel's voice was audible even from across the table. He sounded breathless. He sounded terrified. He told Edgar that they had traced the lease payments. He said every single route led back to a single, dormant entity that had been activated 48 hours ago. Edgar looked at Aurelian. He asked her how she knew. He asked how a distant relation could find a statute that had been buried for half a century. Aurelian stood up. She did not look like a beneficiary. She looked like a sovereign. She told him that some people are taught to read the lines. She was taught to read the water. She walked toward the door. She told him that by sunrise, vessels would be denied mooring rights in every port she controlled. The invisible assets were no longer invisible, and they were no longer his. The fallout was instantaneous. It began with a single digital handshake that was refused. Aurelian Knox-Delmare sat in the back of her car, the city lights blurring into long gold streaks against the glass. On her lap, a tablet displayed the global eyes tracking map. Hundreds of tiny icons, each representing a multi-million-dollar cargo vessel, were pulsing in the North Atlantic. They were the Whitcomb fleet, and they were all turning red. The mooring denial was not a loud event. It was a silent software update. By activating the dormant clauses of the Blue Knot List registry, Aurelian had effectively revoked the right of entry for any vessel tied to Whitcomb and Roe. In the world of maritime law, a ship without a mooring, right, is a ship without a destination. It is a ghost in international waters. Aurelian watched the first vessel, the Whitcomb Sovereign, reach the mouth of the Rotterdam harbor. On her screen, a transcript of the radio exchange appeared. The Port Authority was being polite but firm. They cited a lack of valid subsurface easement clearance. They told the captain that his docking lease had been suspended by the primary deed holder. The captain argued. He cited the trust's global standing. He cited his cargo of high-value electronics. The Port Authority didn't care. They didn't answer to the trust. They answered to the owner of the ground beneath the water. Aurelian touched the brushed platinum Nautilus compass pendant. She felt the vibration of the car's engine. But her mind was on the vibration of the global markets. By denying these ships a place to dock, she was creating a bottleneck that would cost the Whitcomb estate $10 million every hour. Insurance premiums began to skyrocket. Reinsurance protocols were triggered. The high-value educational reality of maritime law was now a strangling cord around Edgar's neck. Edgar Whitcomb III was currently in a boardroom that felt smaller by the second. His phones were ringing off the hook. His partners were shouting. His investors were demanding to know why their optimized assets were floating aimlessly in the English Channel. He didn't have an answer, because the answer required acknowledging a woman he had spent months ignoring. Aurelian's phone vibrated. It was a private number. She let it ring. She knew it was Edgar. She knew he was calling to offer a settlement. He was calling to speak about reason and mutual interest. Let the call go to voicemail. She wasn't interested in a settlement. She was interested in a surrender. She turned her gaze back to the map. The red icons were spreading. The bottleneck was becoming a crisis. The invisible assets had become the only thing the world cared about. And they were the only things Aurelian cared to hold. She was no longer just a beneficiary. She was the gatekeeper of the Atlantic. And the gate was currently closed. The rain did not fall in drops. It fell in sheets, a heavy gray curtain that blurred the line between the city and the sea. Aurelian Knox-Delmare stood at the edge of Pier 17. Kay's charcoal wool coat absorbing the moisture until it looked like armor. She did not carry an umbrella. She stood with her hands folded in front of her, her almond-set eyes fixed on the churning water of the harbor. At her throat, the brushed platinum Nautilus compass pendant was the only spark of light in the gloom. A set of headlights cut through the fog. A black sedan screeched to a halt 20 feet away. Edgar Whitcomb III stepped out. He didn't look like the man from the terminal. His tie was loose. His hair, usually a monument to expensive styling, was matted against his forehead. He looked like a man who had spent the last 6 hours watching his life's work evaporate into a digital abyss. He shouted over the sound of the wind. He asked her what she wanted. He offered her 20% of the trust, then 30%, then a seat on the board with full veto power. Aurelian did not turn around. She waited until he was standing 5 feet behind her, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. She spoke, and her voice carried further than his shouts. She told him that he was still thinking in percentages. She told him that he was still trying to negotiate for a house that had already burned down. She informed him that the mooring denial was no longer just a private dispute, because the vessels were carrying essential goods. The Maritime Safety Committee had been forced to intervene. She revealed the final layer of her systemic trap under the sovereign deed protocols. If a deed holder denies access based on a security breach of fiduciary integrity, the state cannot override it. Instead, the state is forced to place the ships in a federal receivership. Edgar's face went from red to a ghostly, a translucent white. He was a third-generation trustee. He knew exactly what a receivership meant. It meant the government would step in, freeze every account, and audit every transaction made by Whitcomb and Rowe for the last 50 years. It meant every optimized offshore tax loophole and every restructured dividend would be dragged into the light of a federal investigation. He told her she was destroying herself too. He said she would never see a dime of the inheritance if the feds took over. Aurelian finally turned to face him. Her expression was one of chilling, absolute calm. She told him that she had never cared about the dimes. She had been raised by a man who taught her that ownership is not about what you have. It is about what you can stop. She reached up and touched the Nautilus compass. She felt the cold metal. Against her fingertips, she told him that she had already filed for whistleblower protection under the Maritime Fraud Act as the person who exposed the misclassification of infrastructure. She was legally entitled to a 25% bounty of every dollar recovered from his firm's liquidation. The bounty was higher than the inheritance he had tried to steal. She had not just won. She had monetized his destruction. Edgar collapsed against the hood of his car. The policy he had worshipped had become the rope he was hanging by. He looked at the water where his fleet sat idle and red on the horizon. Aurelian walked past him. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She stepped into her car and closed the door. The silence inside was a sanctuary. She checked her tablet one last time. The micro cliffhanger was already unfolding. The legal counsel for the Port Authority had just sent an urgent, crypted file. The file showed that every single subsurface lease in the Atlantic didn't just root back to her dormant entity. They all originated from a coordinate in the North Sea that didn't exist on any modern map. The invisible assets were even deeper than she had imagined. "Drive," she said. The car pulled away, leaving Edgar Whitcomb III alone on a rainy pier. A man who had tried to steal a shadow and lost the sun. The North Sea did not welcome visitors. It was a churning cauldron of slate-gray water and iron-colored mist. Aurelian Knox-Delmare stood on the bridge of the Aurelia, the deck beneath her feet vibrating with the raw power of the ship's engines. She was no longer wearing the charcoal wool of the city. She was dressed in a sleek obsidian-colored tactical parka. Her brushed platinum Nautilus compass pendant tucked securely beneath the zipper. The air in the bridge smelled of cold salt and the ozone of high-frequency radar. On the central monitor, its coordinates from the encrypted file pulsed in a rhythmic blue light. According to the maritime maps of the United Kingdom, Norway, and the Netherlands, this specific patch of ocean was a void. No oil rigs. No shipping lanes. No coral reefs. It was a blind spot in the global grid. Aurelian watched the depth sounder. The numbers were dropping rapidly. They were passing over a trench that was not recorded in any public bathymetric survey. She realized then why the subsurface easements routed back here. This wasn't just a coordinate. It was the hub. If the dry docks and the mooring rights were the spokes of her father's empire, this unmapped point was the axle. Every invisible asset she had seized from Edgar Whitcomb III was legally tethered to whatever sat at the bottom of this trench. The captain of the Aurelia approached her. He was a veteran of the clandestine trade routes, a man who had spent 30 years avoiding the prying eyes of national coast guards. He told her that the sensors were picking up a massive electromagnetic signature. He asked if they should hold position. He said that entering this zone without a naval escort was an act of sovereign trespass. Aurelian did not hesitate. She told him that you cannot trespass on land you already own. She took a small, silver-plated data key from her pocket, the final piece of the Matriarch's will that she had recovered from her father's private vault. She inserted it into the ship's communication array. She didn't broadcast a distress signal. She broadcasted a handshake. She used the sovereign recognition protocol. Below them, the ocean began to change. The dark water churned as a series of massive bioluminescent buoys rose to the surface. They formed a perfect circle around the Aurelia, marking the perimeter of a territory that existed outside of time. From the center of the circle, a structure began to breach the surface. It wasn't a ship. It was a subsurface data fortress, floating sovereign entity built with the stolen billions. Edgar's grandfather had helped conceal. Aurelian touched the Nautilus compass at her throat. She felt the resonance between the pendant and the fortress. This was the invisible asset that everyone depended on. It was the master server for the world's maritime insurance protocols. It was the place where the true deeds of every port on Earth were stored by taking this seat. She wasn't just reclaiming an inheritance. She was assuming control of the global flow of trade. She saw the lights of the fortress flicker as they synchronized with her ship. The board of the Seven Seas had been using this facility as their private playground for decades. Thinking the Knox-Delmare line was extinct, Aurelian stepped onto the deck, the cold wind whipping her hair into a storm of its own. She looked at the fortress, and for the first time in this journey, she smiled. It was a small, sharp smile. The kind of smile a queen gives when she realizes the traitors are still inside her palace. She was no longer the beneficiary. She was the landlord, and the rent was due. The Aurelia pulled alongside the fortress, its black hull looking like a splinter against the massive barnacle-encrusted steel of Station 77. The air here was thin, chilled by the North Sea wind and vibrating with the low-frequency hum of deep water. Cooling systems. Aurelian Knox-Delmare stepped onto the landing platform. She did not wait for an invitation. She walked with the weight of a woman who knew that every bolt, every wire, and every byte of data beneath her feet was hers by sovereign right. At the airlock, a security terminal flickered to life. It didn't ask for a passcode. It deployed a retinal scanner and a high-sensitivity biometric pad. Aurelian placed her hand on the cold glass. She felt the microcurrent of the system verifying her mahogany skin and the specific pulse rate of the Knox-Delmare bloodline. Above her, the brushed platinum Nautilus compass pendant reflected in the security camera's lens. The airlock hissed. The heavy steel door slid open with a sound like a tomb being unsealed. Inside, the fortress was a cathedral of glass and silicon. Suspended in the center of the main hall was a 3-story server stack, encased in liquid nitrogen. This was the master ledger, the ghost registry, that controlled the mooring rights and subsurface easements for every major port on the planet. Aurelian walked toward the command center. She could hear voices, agitated, desperate, and sharp. The board of the Seven Seas was gathered in the sunken conference pit. There were 7 of them, the architects of global trade, men and women who believed they were the shadow government of the ocean. They were staring at a massive holographic display of the Atlantic. They were watching the red icons of the Whitcomb fleet and, now, the yellow icons of their own diverted cargo ships. Aurelian stopped at the edge of the pit. She did not announce herself. She let her presence settle over the room like a cold mist. One of the board members, a man with a Swiss accent and a face like wrinkled parchment, was shouting into a satellite phone. He was demanding to know why the station's power grid was fluctuating. He was demanding to know who had authorized the handshake protocol from the surface. Aurelian spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room's panic, like a blade through silk. She told them that the power was fluctuating because the system was rejecting their credentials. She told them that the handshake was authorized by the only person in the room who didn't need an invitation. The 7 froze. They turned as one, their eyes landing on the woman in the obsidian parka. The Swiss man narrowed his eyes. He asked if she was the beneficiary Whitcomb had failed to manage. He used the word as a slur, a way to remind her of her place in their hierarchy. Aurelian descended the stairs into the pit. She did not look at him. She looked at the server stack. She informed them that as of 3 minutes ago, Station 77 had entered sovereign lockdown under the Maritime continuity clauses. The moment a Knox-Delmare heir steps onto the platform, the temporary administrative access granted to the board is revoked. The room went silent. The lights turned a deep warning red. Aurelian sat in the high-backed chair at the head of the console. She reached up and touched the Nautilus compass. She told them that they had been using her father's infrastructure to build their empires, while paying 0 interest to the estate. They had ignored the maintenance of the easements. They had misclassified the dry docks, and now she was calling in the debt. The Swiss man tried to speak, but the monitors in front of him went black. His satellite phone died in his hand. Aurelian told them that the air filtration and the power for their private escape submersibles were now running on a provisional credit. She asked them if they wanted to negotiate the terms of their surrender, or if they preferred to see how long they could survive in a fortress that no longer recognized their existence. The board of the 7 Seas looked at each other. They looked at the mahogany woman who held the keys to their world. The silence was absolute. And for the first time in 70 years, the board was afraid. The hum of the liquid nitrogen cooling system was the only sound in the command center. It was a rhythmic, mechanical breath that served as a reminder of who controlled the life support of the 7 Aurelian. Knox-Delmare did not look at the board members. She looked at the holographic display, her fingers dancing across the biometric sensors with the fluid grace of a concert pianist. With a single swipe, she cleared the Atlantic shipping map. In its place, a new schematic appeared. It was a three-dimensional rendering of the seabed directly beneath Station 77. The 7 gasped. Even among the elite, only 3 of them knew the full extent of what lay in the trench. Aurelian spoke, her voice echoing off the reinforced steel walls. She revealed the ultimate asset buried 600 feet below the station was a series of reinforced titanium spheres. These were not data centers. They were physical vaults. During the geopolitical collapses of the late 20th century, the Knox-Delmare estate had been commissioned to extract and ensure the sovereign gold reserves of 3 nations that no longer appeared on the UN map. The Board of the 7 Seas had been using this gold as a shadow collateral for their global credit lines. It was the secret floor of the world's economy. Aurelian touched the Nautilus compass pendant. She felt the weight of the secret pressing against her chest. She told them that the collateral was no longer valid. By entering the station, she had reindexed the vault keys to her own biological signature. The Swiss man stepped forward, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and terror. He told her that she couldn't do this. He said that if she moved that gold, the global markets would lose their anchor. He warned her that the resulting inflation would burn the world to the ground. Aurelian finally turned her head to look at him. Her almond-set eyes were as cold as the water outside. She told him that the world was already burning. He just hadn't felt the heat because he was standing on her. Father's ice. She informed the board that the gold was being reclassified as unclaimed sovereign inheritance. Under the 1926 statutes, since the original nations no longer existed, the insurer, the Knox-Delmare, as to became the legal successor of the assets. She had just become the wealthiest woman in human history. She gave them their final choice. She told them they could sign a total fiduciary transfer, handing over their remaining dry docks, mooring rights, and shipping fleets to her holding company. In exchange, she would allow them to leave the station with their lives and enough personal wealth to retire in obscurity. The alternative was simple. She told them she would vent the station's atmosphere and let the North Sea reclaim its secrets. She stood up. She did not wait for their debate. She walked toward the observation deck, looking out at the bioluminescent buoys that marked her new empire. Behind her, the sound of digital styluses hitting screens began. One by one, the 7 were signing away their world. The Matriarch's will was no longer a script or a plan. It was the new reality of the ocean. The air in the private vault was stagnant and smelled of copper and old parchment. It was the scent of forgotten obligations. Aurelian Knox-Delmare stood before the reinforced steel lockers of the Maritime archives, her obsidian parka absorbing the dim, recessed light. She did not rush. She did not fumble. She reached into her inner pocket and pulled out a pair of white silk gloves. Her movements were surgical. Her breathing was a slow, rhythmic tide. She pulled a single heavy ledger from the 3rd shelf. It was bound in whaleskin and sealed with wax that had hardened long before her father was born. This was the master copy of the Southern Port Infrastructure Covenants. She laid it on the reading table. Her fingers traced the embossed seal of the original grantor. At her throat, the brushed platinum Nautilus compass pendant rested against her collarbone. It was steady. It was heavy. It was the physical anchor of her reality. Aurelian opened the ledger to page 412. She was looking for a specific paragraph written in a script that looked like iron thorns. It was the reversionary infrastructure covenant. She read the words slowly. She let the legal Latin settle in her mind. The covenant dictated that any land reclaimed from the sea for industrial maritime use was granted on a 99-year lease. But there was a poison pill hidden in the phrasing. If the land was ever converted to commercial use, it became luxury condos, hotels, or private retail. The ownership did not go to the highest bidder. The ownership snapped back to the original. Grantor Aurelian Knox-Delmare looked at the signature at the bottom of the deed. It was not a name Edgar Whitcomb III would recognize. It was a holding company registered in 1926 under a sovereign maritime charter. It was the same entity that funded her Swiss boarding school. It was the same entity that owned the brushed platinum pendant she wore every day. The grantor was not her father. The grantor was a bloodline office that she now commanded. She stood up and adjusted her parka. She felt the cold clarity of a predator who had just seen the end of the hunt. Edgar Whitcomb III believed he was a titan because he was building glass towers on the waterfront. He believed he was optimizing the trust by converting old shipping yards into high-end real estate. He was a man who understood the surface, but ignored the foundation. He didn't realize that every floor he added to his skyscrapers was increasing the value of the land he was about to lose. Aurelian walked out of the vault and toward the command center of Station 77. The steel floors rang out with the sound of her footsteps, sharp, metallic cadence that announced the end of an era. She sat at the main console. Her mahogany skin looked almost black under the red emergency lights of the station. She began to input the override codes for the global shipping registry. She was not just claiming a piece of land. She was activating a total systemic shutdown. The covenant allowed the grantor to halt all operations on the land if the lease was breached. And converting a shipyard into a shopping mall was the ultimate breach. Aurelian watched the countdown on her screen. It was 11 o'clock at night. In 60 minutes, the legal status of the ports would change. The invisible assets she had seized were the heart. This covenant was the blood. She touched the Nautilus compass. She felt the pulse of the ocean through the sensors of the platform. Edgar was currently at a gala, celebrating the grand opening of the Whitcomb Waterfront Plaza. He was drinking champagne. He was shaking hands with governors and CEOs. He was telling them that the Knox-Delmare name was a relic of the past. He was standing on ground that was currently dissolving beneath his feet. Aurelian closed her eyes and visualized the map. The dry docks, the mooring rights, the subsurface EASEMENTS. Every single one of them was tied to the reversionary clause. She hit the final key. The command was sent. She did not feel regret. She did not feel anger. She felt the balance of the world shifting back to its rightful center. She had been dismissed as a clerical error. She had been ignored as a distant relation. Now, she was the person who owned the very air Edgar was breathing. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight. The temperature in the command center dropped as the liquid nitrogen cooling systems accelerated. Aurelian remained perfectly still. She was a statue of patience. She knew that in less than an hour, the global economy would experience a seizure. Every ship currently in a Whitcomb port would be legally barred from moving. Every tenant in a Whitcomb building would be trespassing on sovereign land. The betrayal was being erased by the law that preceded it. Aurelian opened her eyes. The screen was flashing a single message in white text. Covenant activated. She looked out at the dark horizon of the North Sea. The bioluminescent buoys were pulsing with a new rhythm. The silence was coming. And this time, it would be permanent. Midnight in Manhattan arrived with the sound of silence at the Whitcomb Waterfront Plaza. The crystal chandeliers flickered once, then dimmed to a ghostly amber. Edgar Whitcomb III stood on the glass balcony of his new penthouse, a vintage cognac in his hand. He was looking down at the rows of container ships docked along the Hudson, their lights twinkling like a promise of infinite revenue. He didn't notice the change at first. He didn't see the black-clad port authorities stepping onto the gangways. He didn't hear the engines of his fleet cutting out simultaneously across the Atlantic. Then his phone didn't just ring. It screamed. Aurelian Knox-Delmare sat in the command center of Station 77, watching the data streams collapse. Her face was illuminated by the blue glow of the monitors, highlighting the sharp appraisal in her almond-set eyes. She touched the brushed platinum Nautilus compass pendant. It was a cold, physical reminder of the law she had just unleashed. The reversionary infrastructure covenant was not a suggestion. It was a legal guillotine. By converting the industrial dockyards into luxury retail space, Edgar had triggered an automatic expiration of the 1926 land grants. The moment the clock struck 12, every square inch of the Whitcomb waterfront ceased to be his property. Ownership had snapped back to the grantor, and the grantor was a Urelian dot in the penthouse. Edgar's lead counsel stumbled toward him, his face the color of bone. He held a tablet that showed a notice of immediate asset seizure. He told Edgar that they weren't being sued. They were being evicted. The counsel explained the snapback protocol. Because the land was now classified as a breached sovereign grant, the government had no power to intervene. The law of the original deed superseded the city's zoning permits. Edgar looked at the harbor. The ships were dead in the water. The cranes had stopped mid-swing. The multi-billion-dollar logistics chain that held his empire together had just been severed by a single paragraph. In a whaleskin ledger, Aurelian watched the feed from the plaza's security cameras. She saw Edgar drop his cognac. She saw the guests whispering in the shadows. She saw the panic of a man who realized he was standing on a floor he no longer owned. She did not feel pity. She felt the weight of the clean read. She spoke into the station's intercom. Her voice was transmitted directly to the private line of every port director in the hemisphere. She told them that the leases were void. She told them that all transit through the Knox-Delmare easements was suspended, until further notice. The internal monologue in Aurelian's mind was a symphony of numbers. She was calculating the cost of the standstill. Every minute the ship sat idle, the insurance liabilities doubled. Every second the plaza stayed open, the trespass. Penalties accrued at a rate that would bankrupt a small nation. She had not just stopped the business. She had turned the business into a debt machine that was eating. Edgar Alive. Edgar finally dialed her number. Aurelian picked up. She didn't say hello. She didn't wait for his plea. She told him that the champagne he was drinking was technically her property. She told him that the tuxedo he was wearing was bought with credit lines secured by land that now belonged to her. She informed him that the power flip was complete. Edgar's voice was a jagged rasp. He asked her what it would take to turn the lights back on. He talked about economic stability and global responsibility. Aurelian reached up and adjusted the Nautilus compass. She felt the steady vibration of the station's core. She told him that the lights wouldn't be coming back on for him. She told him that the Matriarch's will didn't include a provision for mercy. She ended the call on her screen. The map of the harbor was a sea of red. The shipping world had halted. The invisible assets were now a wall that no one could climb over. Aurelian Knox-Delmare sat in the center of the storm she had created. She was the landlord of the Atlantic, and she was finally home. The silence of the Atlantic was not empty. It was filled with the electronic screams of 1,000 failing contracts. Aurelian Knox-Delmare remained at the helm of Station 77. The red emergency glow reflected off her high-sculpted cheekbones, casting long, sharp shadows across the command deck. She was the only person on the planet who truly knew the value of the silence she had created on the primary monitor. The global asset ledger was scrolling at a blinding speed. It wasn't just shipping routes anymore. The snapback protocol of the reversionary covenant. had reached into the deep tissue of the Whitcomb estate's banking structure. Because the Whitcomb Waterfront Plaza was the primary collateral for Edgar's global credit lines. The sudden loss of land ownership had triggered a cross-default cascade. In the language of Tier 1 finance, Edgar Whitcomb III was no longer just broke. He was legally radioactive. Aurelian watched as the Board of the Seven Seas tried to intervene. On her secondary screen, she saw encrypted attempts to bypass the station's lockdown. They were trying to reroute their private capital into offshore havens before the federal auditors arrived. She did not let them. She activated the Fiduciary. Freeze. This was the institutional revenge she had been holding in reserve. Under the Maritime continuity clauses, if a sovereign deed holder identifies a systemic fraud, they have the power to place all associated accounts into a civilian escrow. She touched the brushed platinum Nautilus compass pendant. She felt the cold precision of the law beneath her fingertips, in a luxury hotel suite in London. The Swiss board member watched as his private accounts were zeroed out. In a penthouse in Dubai, another member found their credit lines cut in the middle of a transaction. The seven were being dismantled. One account at a time. Aurelian's internal monologue was a cold appraisal of the ruins. She thought of her father, the man whose name was never on paper, but whose systems were now reclaiming the world. He had taught her that real power doesn't need to shout. It only needs to be the one who defines the terms. Edgar Whitcomb III was no longer on the balcony. He was in the back of a black car, speeding toward the only private airstrip he still thought he controlled. Aurelian watched his GPS signature on the map. She watched as he reached the gate of the airfield. She watched as the gate did not open. The airstrip was built on a subsurface easement that routed back to her registry. The moment Edgar's name was flagged for sovereign trespass, the security systems had locked down the entire facility. He was trapped between a city he no longer owned and an ocean that refused to let him dock. Aurelian leaned back in her chair. The red lights of the station slowly shifted back to a calm. Deep blue dot. She had fulfilled the requested word count of the strategy. She had executed the Matriarch's will with the surgical precision of a maritime insurance underwriter. The shipping world remained at a standstill, but for Aurelian, the movement was just beginning. She wasn't just a beneficiary anymore. She was the infrastructure. She closed the final ledger. The boardroom of Whitcomb and Rowe was no longer a place of business. It was a pressure cooker. The temperature had risen 5 degrees as the central VCF. If you're using like a scanner app and it's like a scanner app, and it's like you're gonna die. Like, look at this, / look at this. And we all know I've been exploring. And we explore and we elude. I've been exploring that path. I've started / as we had quoted this, with convective. I've said we / conflorsing. I've said we said. I've said / quash palic. It's consication. Going to side you / you with second week. Decide with we at we can greet you to caclade with sefkin with a c to kikakike to side we see to you sick to see with kiss gay with the I with you way side could get sick you with kikak you could do it quick with I with kick things sick to desk see what I cooling systems struggled to compensate for the frantic energy of 12 desperate men. The air tasted of recycled oxygen and expensive, bitter espresso. It was the scent of a collapse. Aurelian Knox-Delmare sat at the center of the mahogany table. She was a fixed point in a swirling storm. Her skin, the color of deep mahogany, seemed to absorb the frantic light of the room. Her hair was pulled back into that precise low chenya knot, a single strand out of place. She did not move. She did not drink the water. She did not look at the frantic charts flickering on the wall. Monitors. Aurelian's fingers rested lightly on her brushed platinum Nautilus compass pendant. The metal felt cool against her skin, a sharp contrast to the heated shouting matches erupting around her. The CEO of the Maritime conglomerate was leaning over the table, his face a mask of sweating, crimson desperation. He was shouting about supply chain paralysis. He was shouting about the 142 ships currently anchored in international waters. unable to dock, unable to unload, and unable to move. He was demanding a solution. He was demanding a name to sue. He was demanding a reason why the entire infrastructure of the Atlantic had suddenly stopped recognizing their clearance codes. Aurelian said nothing. She watched him. Her almond-set eyes appraised the man, not as a leader, but as a failing component in a system she had already bypassed. Beside the CEO, Edgar Whitcomb III was a ghost. He sat slumped in his chair, his expensive silk tie loosened, his eyes fixed on the empty space in front of him. He knew what the others were only beginning to realize. He knew that the shouting was a waste of breath. The noise in the room was deafening. There were arguments about litigation. There were arguments about emergency government intervention. There were arguments about the legality of the sovereign reversionary covenant. Every time one man stopped to breathe, another took up the scream. They were terrified of the silence that sat at the center of the table. Aurelian touched the Nautilus compass. She felt the steady pulse of her own heart. In her mind, she was not in Manhattan. She was back in the private archives, reading the Maritime law statutes from 1926. She was visualizing the invisible network of dry docks and mooring rights that were now under her absolute control. The men in this room believed that power was something you projected through volume. They believed that the loudest voice in the room was the one in command. Aurelian knew that true power is the one who can afford to be silent. She had already executed the fiduciary asset seizure. She had already filed the foreclosure of infrastructure. The law was not a debate to be won. It was a machine she had already started. The shouting continued for another 20 minutes. It reached a crescendo of accusations and threats. They threatened her with federal prison. They threatened her with total blacklisting. Aurelian did not flinch. She did not blink. She simply sat. Finally, the air seemed to run out of the room. One by one, the voices faltered. The CEO's face faded from crimson to a dull, sickly gray. He looked at Aurelian. He looked at the way her fingers rested on the compass. He looked at the digital clock on the wall. It was now 2 o'clock in the afternoon. 2 o'clock was the deadline for the International Maritime Clearinghouse to verify the deed holders. The CEO's phone vibrated on the table. He did not pick it up. He stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. He looked at Aurelian again. He saw the stillness in her posture. He saw the cold appraisal in her eyes. In that moment, the shouting stopped completely. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy. It was a physical weight that pressed down on the shoulders of every man in the room. The CEO realized the truth. He realized that Aurelian Knox-Delmare hadn't spoken because she didn't need to. The law had already spoken for her. The infrastructure had already spoken for her. The silence wasn't a pause. It was the sentence. The silence in the boardroom had become a living thing. It was no longer the absence of noise. It was the presence of an absolute, unmoving power. Edgar Whitcomb III finally looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, tracing the outline of the brushed platinum Nautilus compass pendant around Aurelian's neck. He realized that for 3 generations, his family had been playing a game of checkers, while the Knox-Delmares were writing the physics of the board. Aurelian Knox-Delmare moved. It was a slight shift, a subtle uncrossing of her ankles. But every man in the room flinched. She did not speak to the CEO. She did not speak to Edgar. She spoke to the room. Her voice, a low, steady chime that carried the weight of a century of maritime law. She told them that the deadline for verification had passed. She informed them that the International Maritime Clearinghouse had officially recognized the reversionary infrastructure covenant. She revealed the final calculation. The Whitcomb fleet was not just stuck. It was now legally considered unclaimed cargo in sovereign waters, under the 1926 statutes she had cited. A deed holder who is denied fiduciary transparency for more than 72 hours is granted automatic receivership over all vessels currently moored within their easements. The CEO tried to stand, but his knees buckled. He whispered a single word: piracy. Aurelian did not smile. She told him that piracy is the act of taking what belongs to another. She told him that she was simply collecting what had been hidden in her own basement for 70 years. She stood up. The movement was a masterpiece of quiet, luxury fluid, expensive. And final dot, she told them that the liquidation of Whitcomb and Rowe was no longer a matter of debate. It was a matter of math. She informed them that the federal marshals were already at the ground floor. They weren't there to discuss policy. They were there to execute the asset seizure warrants she had pre-authorized through the Swiss tribunal. She walked toward the door. As she reached the threshold, she paused. She did not look back at the men who had tried to erase her. She told Edgar Whitcomb III that the letter he had sent Hertha I, declaring her non-controlling, would be framed and hung in her new office. It would serve as a reminder that the loudest men are often the ones with the least to say. She stepped out into the hallway. The door closed behind her with a soft, expensive click. Aurelian Knox-Delmare walked toward the elevator. The silence that breaks men was now behind her. Ahead of her was the open sea and the total reclamation of the Matriarch's will. The temperature in the audit room of the Federal Maritime Commission was a brutal, artificial chill. It was the kind of cold that forced the lungs to tighten and the mind to sharpen. Aurelian Knox-Delmare sat at the head of a table piled high with the digital wreckage of the Whitcomb Empire. She did not touch the screen in front of her. She did not need to. The data was moving in a one-way direction. It was the direction of absolute gravity. Aurelian's skin, that deep and cool mahogany, seemed to hold the dim light of the room. Her expression was a mask of permanent appraisal. Her almond-set eyes tracking the movement of a dozen federal agents as they dismantled 70 years of corporate deceit at her collarbone. The brushed platinum Nautilus compass pendant caught the flicker of a passing tablet. It was the only thing in the room that felt solid. It was the only thing that felt permanent. The audit was not a conversation. It was a dissection. Without port access, the Whitcomb revenue streams had turned into a flat line. The hundreds of vessels idling in international waters were no longer assets. They were liabilities. They were leaking money at a rate of $500,000 per hour in insurance premiums, fuel costs, and labor penalties. Aurelian watched the internal collapse through the lens of a mathematician. She understood that a trust is only as strong as its ability to fulfill its fiduciary duty. She reached up and touched the cool metal of the Nautilus compass. She had triggered the fiduciary instrument reclassification under the sovereign deed protocols. The moment the ports were closed, the Whitcomb trusts were legally flagged as mismanaged. This was the critical pivot. A mismanaged trust loses its shield of limited liability. It becomes an open wound that the Federal Oversight Committee is required by law to cauterize. The agents in the room were not looking for clerical errors. They were looking for the infrastructure leakage. They were following the trail of every dollar that had been diverted from her father's maritime holdings into Edgar's personal shell companies. The silence of the room was punctuated only by the soft, rapid clicking of keyboards. Aurelian Knox-Delmare felt the moment the center of gravity shifted. She saw it in the way the lead auditor's posture changed. She saw it in the way the digital ledger on the main wall turned from a steady blue to a flashing, urgent crimson. The betrayal was no longer a secret. It was a statistical certainty. Edgar Whitcomb III was not in the room. He was currently in an interrogation suite 3 floors above, trying to explain why 30% of his restructured revenue had been routed through a non-existent dredging project in the Southern Gulf. He was speaking in policy. He was hiding behind precedent. He was despised as the silence that was now consuming him. Aurelian's internal monologue was a cold, rhythmic recitation of the law. She thought about the Swiss boarding school where she had learned that ownership is a language of silence. She thought about her father, the man who knew that if you control the systems, the people will follow. She had not just taken the money back. She had turned the system into an audit that was eating the Whitcomb dynasty from the inside out. Every offshore account was being mapped. Every tax loophole was being closed. Every sovereign deed she held was acting as a legal anchor, holding the Whitcomb assets in place while the government stripped them to the bone. The lead auditor approached Aurelian. He held a high encryption tablet. His face was a mask of professional shock. He asked her if she knew about the indemnity trigger. Aurelian did not answer. Immediately, she let the silence fill the space between them. She let him feel the weight of her stillness. She told him that some clauses are written to protect the trustee. Others are written to bury them. She informed him that the sovereign foreclosure she had filed 48 hours ago had bypassed the standard corporate protections. It had reached into the private, personal vaults of the Whitcomb family. The audit was no longer limited to the firm. It had reached the private art collections, the vineyard in France, and the offshore accounts that Edgar thought were invisible. Aurelian stood up. Every movement was deliberate. Every movement cost the dynasty another layer of its skin. She walked toward the window, looking out at the gray city. She could see the harbor in the distance. The ships were still there, silent and red on the horizon. She reached up and adjusted the Nautilus compass. She knew that the final revelation was about to drop. She knew that the audit had just uncovered the personal indemnity clause. Edgar Whitcomb III didn't just lose the firm. He was about to lose his freedom. The audit had finished its meal. Now, it was time to collect the remains. Aurelian Knox-Delmare watched the first federal vehicle pull away from the curb below. It was heading toward the airport. It was heading toward the final seizure. The silence that breaks men was finally complete. The silence in the audit room was replaced by a digital roar. Across the screens, the Whitcomb & Rowe logo was being replaced by the seal of the Federal Maritime Receivership. Aurelian Knox-Delmare stood by the glass, her reflection a sharp dark line against the cold city. She watched the data streams until the final red bar reached the end of the graph. The revenue collapse was absolute, total, permanent. She turned back to the lead auditor. She did not need to ask the question. He confirmed it. The personal indemnity clause had fully activated, in his haste to secure the restructured loans. Edgar Whitcomb III had signed a document that pierced his own corporate veil. He had gambled his personal bloodline assets on the assumption that Aurelian would never find the key to the infrastructure. He had bet his life that she was a distant relation with no memory. He had lost Aurelian touched the brushed platinum Nautilus compass pendant. It felt warm, as if it had absorbed the energy of the dynasty's disintegration. She told the auditor that the mismanaged fiduciary instruments were now legally reclassified as criminal negligence. This wasn't just a bankruptcy anymore. It was a forensic hunt for every stolen dollar. She informed him that she had already provided the coordinates for the offshore servers. She had already provided the keys to the private vaults. She was not just a victim of his betrayal. She was the architect of his prosecution. Aurelian walked out of the audit room. She did not take the stairs. She did not hurry. She reached the ground floor just as a black government SUV pulled up to the curb. Two agents emerged, carrying boxes of seized personal documents. Among them was the framed portrait of Edgar's grandfather, the man who had started the theft in 1954. Aurelian watched as the portrait was tossed into the back of the vehicle like common trash. She felt the finality of the moment. The audit that eats a dynasty was finished. There was nothing left of Whitcomb & Rowe but the dust on the ledgers. She stepped into her own car. Her internal monologue was quiet now. The calculations were over. The balance had been struck. She checked her tablet one last time. Edgar Whitcomb III was being processed. His personal assets were frozen. His indemnity was being called in. He was a man with a prestigious name and a prison cell waiting for him. Aurelian Knox-Delmare looked out at the harbor. The ships were moving again, but they were no longer flying the Whitcomb flag. They were flying the colors of the Knox-Delmare legacy. The betrayal had been an error in classification, and that error had been erased. The demolition of an empire does not always require explosives. Sometimes it only requires a signature and 72 hours of surgical silence. The Lobby of the Whitcomb Tower was cold. The air conditioning continued to hum. But the soul of the building had been hollowed out. Federal agents moved through the corridors like white cells attacking a virus. They carried boxes of digital drives and physical files. They moved with the cold efficiency of a foreclosure. Aurelian Knox-Delmare stood in the center of the mezzanine. She looked up at the massive bronze letters mounted on the marble wall. Whitcomb and Row. One of the letters was already loose. A workman on a ladder was unscrewing the copper bolts. The name that had defined the city's maritime economy for 3 generations was being dismantled. It was being removed from the ledger of history. Aurelian did not smile. She did not feel the need for a victory lap. She simply adjusted the brushed platinum Nautilus compass pendant at her throat. The metal felt heavy and certain against her mahogany skin. The internal monologue of the room was a symphony of falling paper. Edgar Whitcomb III was no longer a factor. He had been barred from fiduciary service for life by the Swiss Tribunal and the Federal Maritime Commission. His license was gone. His reputation was a black hole. His ability to move a single dollar was a memory. Aurelian watched as 2 men in gray overalls approached the executive gallery. They took down the oil portrait of Edgar's father. It was a heavy gilded frame that had presided over decades of restructured theft. They didn't treat it with respect. They leaned it against a trash receptacle. The betrayal was finally being corrected in the physical world. Aurelian's almond-set eyes tracked the movement of the lead auditor. He was carrying a final document. It was the dissolution of fiduciary standing under the sovereign deed protocols. A firm that has been found to misclassify its infrastructure loses its corporate charter. It does not go into bankruptcy protection. It dissolves. Every contract is voided. Every asset is re-indexed. The institutional revenge was absolute. Aurelian walked toward the revolving doors. She could see the crowd of reporters gathered on the sidewalk. They were like sharks sensing blood in the water. They were shouting questions at anyone who emerged from the building. They were asking about the missing billions. They were asking about the ports. They were asking who had the power to stop the global shipping market with a single clause. Aurelian stepped out into the biting morning air. The flashes of a dozen cameras erupted in her face. She did not flinch. She did not shield her eyes. She moved with the deliberate grace of a woman who had already seen the end of the world and survived it. One reporter shoved a microphone toward her. He asked her what her role was in the collapse. He asked her if she was the clerical beneficiary everyone was talking about. Aurelian stopped. She looked at the reporter. Her silence was a vacuum that sucked the noise out of the street. She told him that some names are written on buildings to hide the truth. She told him that other names are never written at all because they don't need to be. She informed him that the ports were no longer under management. They were back under sovereign custody. The micro cliffhanger hung in the air like a cold mist. The reporters went quiet. They realized they weren't talking to a beneficiary. They were talking to the owner. The name was removed from the building, but the shadow of Aurelian Knox-Delmare now covering the entire harbor. The sidewalk in front of the dissolving Whitcomb Tower was a sea of flashing lights and shouted questions. To the world, the story was about a financial scandal. To Aurelian Knox-Delmare, it was a long overdue accounting. She walked through the crowd, her presence acting like a prow through water. She didn't look at the cameras. She didn't look at the frantic reporters. She looked at the horizon, where the cranes of the port were finally beginning to move again. Time under her command. She reached the black car waiting for her at the curb. Before she entered, she paused and looked back at the building one last time. The space where the bronze Whitcomb letters once sat was now just a collection of dark, unweathered stone. The legacy was gone. The erasure was total. Aurelian sat in the back of the car, the interior silence a sanctuary from the chaos outside. She checked her tablet. The final sovereign deed transfer had been confirmed. She had moved beyond the inheritance Edgar had tried to steal. She had reclaimed the infrastructure of the third port. In the world of high-value maritime law, she was no longer a person. She was a jurisdiction. Her internal monologue was a steady, cold assessment of the future. The betrayal had cost Edgar his freedom and his family name. But for Aurelian, the cost of victory was a permanent seat at a table that most people didn't even know existed. She reached up and touched the brushed platinum Nautilus compass pendant. It felt heavier now. It was no longer a memory of her father. It was a symbol of her own authority. The reporter's question was finally answered. Not by a press release, but by the movement of the sea. The Knox-Delmare systems were back online. The Matriarch's will had been executed to the final cent. Aurelian. Knox-Delmare watched the city recede in the rearview mirror. The name was off the building. The villain was in the audit room. And the ports were home. The night was a heavy velvet. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the Hyries office with a rhythmic, percussive intensity. It was the sound of a world being washed clean. Aurelian Knox-Delmare stood alone at the window, her reflection ghosting over the dark harbor below. The room behind her was silent. No phones rang. No assistants scurried. The air was cool and smelled of beeswax and old leather-bound books. It was the scent of a legacy restored. She did not move. Her mahogany skin looked like polished obsidian in the dim light. Her hair remained in its precise chignon, a testament to a discipline that never wavered. Below her, the harbor was a sea of shifting lights. Tiny sparks of gold and red began to drift toward the open ocean. The ships were moving again. They were crossing the invisible lines of the subsurface easements. They were docking at the dry docks that had been silent for 72 hours. They were moving because she allowed it. Aurelian reached up and touched the brushed platinum Nautilus compass pendant. The metal was cold at first, then warmed as it drew heat from her skin. It was no longer just a compass. It was the master key to a system that the world finally recognized, that the internal monologue of the room was a countdown to a total institutional collapse. Off-screen, miles away in a sterile government building, the final pillars of Wickham and Row were being pulled down. Aurelian thought about Edgar Wickham III. She thought about his speeches on policy and his belief that a desk made him a king. He had spent his life managing a trust he didn't understand. He had treated the maritime economy like a bank account. He never realized that the ocean has its own laws. He never realized that the ground beneath the waves belongs to those who know how to claim it. The betrayal was now a historical footnote. The restructuring was a case study in fiduciary failure. Aurelian turned away from the window. She walked toward the massive mahogany desk that had once belonged to her father. She sat in the high-backed chair. The leather creaked softly, welcoming the rightful heir. She did not look at the news reports on the screens. She did not need to see the images of the Wickham name being scrubbed from the city's skyline. She knew that the institution was dead. It had been killed by its own arrogance. It had been erased by the very infrastructure it tried to seize. Aurelian opened a single physical ledger on the desk. She picked up a fountain pen. She began to write a new set of instructions for the Sovereign Ghost Protocol. The information value of her move was now clear to every Tier 1 bank in the world. They were all watching. They were all waiting to see what the new Matriarch would do. They understood that the global shipping lanes were now under a single silent command. The informative power of the maritime continuity clauses had been proven. The law was no longer a weapon used against her. It was the throne she sat upon. Aurelian Knox-Delmare felt the pulse of the harbor through the soles of her feet. She felt the weight of the Nautilus against her chest. She was untouched. The scandals, the shouting, and the legal battles were noise for the masses. For her, it was simply the math of ownership. She looked at the clock. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. The institution was gone. The name was removed. The villain was a memory. Aurelian leaned back and closed her eyes. She let the sound of the rain fill the room. The system finally saw her. And what it saw was a woman who owned the horizon. The rain began to soften, turning from a heavy downpour into a fine silver mist that clung to the windows. The city lights of New York twinkled in the distance, but the real power was here, in this room, concentrated in the hands of the woman the system finally saw, Aurelian. Knox-Delmare looked down at the central monitor of her desk. The screen was a sea of data pulsing with the lifeblood of the global economy. Every major bank, every national shipping authority, and every member of the board of the 7 Seas was waiting. They were all tuned to the same encrypted frequency. Watching a silent terminal, she did not keep them waiting for long. Aurelian reached up and adjusted the brushed platinum Nautilus compass pendant. It sat perfectly centered, a symbol of direction in a world that had lost its way. She felt the heavy silence of the night. A silence she had earned through years of cold patience and surgical calculation. She began to type. Her fingers moved with a rhythmic, final certainty. She did not issue a request. She issued a global sovereign mandate. The mandate was a masterstroke of maritime jurisdictional power. Under the final provisions of the Knox-Delmare legacy, she declared all subsurface easements and dry docks under her control as a PNO, as a PNO key sovereign neutral zone. This meant that the old games of the board, the price fixing, the artificial bottlenecks, and the fiduciary theft were over. Any vessel that violated the new transparency protocols would find its mooring rights revoked instantly and permanently. She was not just managing the trade. She was the trade's conscience. Aurelian watched the acknowledgement lights blink on her screen. One by one, the titans of industry submitted. The Swiss tribunal, the North Sea fortress, the ports of the Gulf Coast, they all sent the same 2-word response: mandate, accepted. The internal monologue in Aurelian's mind was one of absolute resolution. She thought of her father, whose invisible empire was finally visible to the only eyes that mattered, hers. She had turned his survival strategy into a global standard off screen. The institutions of the past were being liquidated into history books. The Whitcomb name was being scrubbed from every database, replaced by a legal footnote about the dangers of arrogance. Edgar was a ghost, haunted by the clauses he never read. Aurelian Knox-Delmare stood up from the desk. She walked back to the window. The first light of dawn was breaking over the Atlantic. It was a cold, sharp light that turned the gray water into a sheet of hammered silver. The ships were still moving, steady procession of gold and red icons on the horizon. They were moving into a world where ownership was no longer a secret. It was a law. Aurelian touched the Nautilus compass one last time. She was untouched by the chaos of the transition. She was a fixed point. She was the Matriarch. The final freeze frame held her silhouette against the rising sun. The system didn't just see her. It obeyed her.